Iran, let's be diplomatic and let's be strategic. I'm Alex, and I'm super excited to be presenting this to you all tonight. A boiling point was reached in the tension between the American and Iranian governments in 1979. This happened after a group of restless Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran, taking more than 50 people prisoner. I'm sure some of the people in our audience will remember this from when they were kids. Most of these prisoners were American citizens. Tonight, I will be telling you all the story of how this shaped American foreign policy for decades to come, as well, importantly, how the American media's perception of the hostage crisis shaped our foreign policy towards Iran, and how that affected millions of lives on the way. First, let's get some context, though. Because at the time, Iran's biggest trading partner was Nazi Germany. As you'd imagine, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, as the Allied powers, were not super cool with this. This treaty basically meant that Iran would sever all ties with the Nazi Party while making the Allied powers their biggest trading partners. This secured economic security towards the Iranian economy and towards the Iranian people. Subsequently, the Soviet Union invaded northern Iran in 1946. Sound familiar? The difference is, though, very quickly they were met by American and British forces at the border and were driven out with relative ease. This kind of took the Soviet Union out of the picture of Iran's foreign policy, making them an enemy, while making the bonds between America, Iran, and Great Britain even stronger. Now, all was well and good until 1952, when a democratically elected prime minister by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh grew popular. Now, Mohammad Mossadegh was something that the CIA and the British government really didn't like. He wanted to nationalize the oil industry in Iran. And as you know, the British and the Americans really don't like it when you mess with their oil. So in classic CIA fashion, they organized a coup and overthrew the democratically elected government in 1952, instating an American-backed dictator who really was a dictator. He spent tens of millions of dollars on himself, while millions of his own people lived in immense poverty and starved. Now, as you'd all would imagine, this led to a significant increase in civil unrest, as well as an increase in radical political movements at the time, including the non-secular movement led by a man by the name of Ayatollah Khomeini. Now, he had been a religious official, but as soon as his non-secular movement became popular, he became a revolutionary political leader who overthrew the government in 1979. One thing led to another, and America extradited their dictator, who they had previously placed in Iran, Reza Pahlavi Shah, to guarantee his security. Obviously, the Iranian people didn't like this. They wanted to bring him to justice in their homeland. So as a bargaining token for him, Ayatollah Khomeini egged on his supporters to storm this American embassy and take the hostages. This proved to be unsuccessful, though, as the Shah died peacefully in the United States a few hundred days after he arrived, and 400 days later, the hostages were peacefully returned. It is no coincidence that this happened on the very first day of Ronald Reagan's presidency. This crisis undoubtedly caused Jimmy Carter, the incumbent, to lose this election on a landslide. He had a pro-diplomacy stance with Iran for the first 6 months of the crisis, whereas Ronald Reagan was a more speak-with-our-fist kind of guy. He had a more aggressive stance and was less open to negotiation and was more open to military force. Ronald Reagan winning on a landslide set a dangerous precedent for years to come, that having a pro-Iranian stance as an American politician would be political suicide. But in order for an issue to be political, someone like you or me really has to care about it. And in order for someone like you or me to have to care about it, you have to know about it. And the American media largely controls what we think, whether we like it or not. And our friends at Fox and CNN sensationalize this crisis like none other. More often than not, they would allude to the imminent downfall of the theocratic regime in Iran. And more dangerously, they would often pin the wrongdoings of the Iranian government on the Iranian people as a whole. It is no coincidence that during this time, hate crimes against Iranian Americans hit an all-time high. as xenophobia was present among all the American populace. In fact, that year, the Justice Department demanded that more than 50,000 Iranian students in the United States report to an immigration office or leave the country. A whole ethnic group singled out just because it became politically popular for that to happen. Now, that xenophobia was alive 50 years ago as it was 20 years ago. George Bush, in his first State of the Union address after the attacks on 9/11, called Iran an axis of evil, which was arming to threaten the peace of the world. Fighting words from a sitting American president. Now that Iranophobia is still alive today, and it's stronger than ever. In 2015, a Pew Research Center poll showed that more than 76% of Americans had a negative opinion on Iran as a whole. This affirms the precedent that I mentioned earlier, that if you're an aspiring American politician, holding a pro-diplomacy stance with Iran could potentially discount 76% of your voter base. This perpetuates the Iranophobia as it creates an anti-Iranian rhetoric, which is cyclical, and as we've seen in the past, and as I will explain later, leads to humanitarian disaster across the world. Now let's head back to the modern day and to some politics. In 2015, sanctions were lifted against Iran. They were originally imposed to curtail Iran's very illegal nuclear production. This was part of a deal that I'm sure most of you have heard of, and that most Americans know of as the Iran nuclear deal. This deal guaranteed security to the Iranian economy by guaranteeing that the United States and the rest of the international community would open trade again to Iran, while also allowing a high degree of transparency in Iranian nuclear facilities, allowing the United Nations to position facilitators in these nuclear facilities, making sure that the enriched uranium production does not reach a certain level agreed upon in the deal. This level is not even close enough to create a dangerous weapon. In fact, in 2017, as part of Donald Trump's Donald Trump's meeting with the United Nations Committee on Disarmament, he affirmed Iran's compliance with the deal, in that they hadn't transgressed at all during his presidency. However, for some reason, 3 months later, he followed through on his biggest campaign promise going into the election, that he would withdraw from the Iran deal. Now, by this, once again, we isolated Iran from the global stage and from the benefits of industrialism, while also shooting ourselves in the foot a little bit. At the time of the deal, Iran had a GDP higher than $400 billion, bigger than Norway or Israel. In theory, making it a bigger trading partner than the two of those, some of our most valuable allies. As well, it is a huge population in close proximity to some of our bigger threats like Russia and China. Being allied with Iran, or even being amicable with Iran, would mean having a close ally in close proximity to